But another cool rain story was, so I went to another area. It was called Ahuachapan, and it was like up in the mountains. It was just this crazy place, and like so cool. They had these huge open air markets with just like tons of fruit that I'd never seen before, and it was just like, I mean, it was just nuts. It was cool, and that was the area right after this last area I was talking about. So when I was working with Elder Hammond, right before I got transferred, we had been teaching a family of like 6. So I get transferred and I'm like, dang it, you know? And I was like, you know what, I could ask my mission president if I can go back, but at the end of the day, like, it doesn't really matter if I'm there. The family like is going to get baptized. Hopefully like a member baptizes them and you know, and that's good enough. And so I just kind of was like bummed because I just really loved this family. So we go back, or we're in Ahuachapan, and I get a call one night that's like, hey, you can go back to your area to baptize this family. So we go back. The baptism is incredible. It's awesome. They had gotten married before I got there, so like, you know, so it was just, I mean, it was just an awesome experience. And actually the mom and the dad at that point didn't end up getting baptized because they had to like kind of wait for a couple things. But the kids did, and the kids were like, it was like 18, 19, and I think one was like 16. So we go back, awesome service, and totally cool. But to get back to Ahuachapan, it was like from where I was, which is called Rio Sarco, to the middle of downtown Santa Ana, it was like 20 minutes. And then from there to Ahuachapan, it was like an hour and 10 minutes. And from Ahuachapan, it was like an hour in this rickety old bus up this huge mountain, because my area was just a high mountain village. So it's like an hour and a half up this mountain. So we get there to Ahuachapan after forever, and it's like 7:10. And as we're getting there, the last bus leaves. And we get out, and all of a sudden we realize that it is like a massive storm above us. And we're like, oh crap. So we're sitting there on the side of the road, and this truck comes by, and he's like, get in. So we jump in the back of this pickup, and and there's people on the side with us, like a mom and her 2 little girls, and then like some other people. So we all jump in, and I think we ended up paying the guy, because that's a ton of weight to be in the back of a truck, and it's like, you know, he's super poor. So we jump in the truck, and we start going up, and it just starts pouring. Like, it just started pouring. And I remember my companion was from Colombia. We're sitting there with our jackets on, because we were in suits for the baptism. So we're sitting there with our suit coats on, and we take them off and we put them like to cover the little girls, because like, well, mostly because the Salvadorian people are super superstitious. So if they like think they get wet, like they're like, oh, I'm gonna get the flu and die. Like they all think like getting wet is just, you're dead. So, you know, these girls are there, and the mom is just like distraught. So we take off our jackets and cover, and we're talking with the mom. We're trying to like console her, and you can't hear anything because it's just pouring. And there's like water coming over like the upside of the mountain as we're cutting across, and just gushing across the road, and the water is like, you know, like up this far on the tires, and at one point it was covering the tops of the tires, and the car's going super slow, so we're all kind of scared that the truck's just gonna get like swept off the edge and we're just gonna roll like to our death. Like, I'd never been in a situation like that. And so we get to this one midway point called Ataco. So there was Ataco, and we were in Apaneca. That was the name of this village that we were in. And that's where this truck was headed. So it's like at the end of its journey, and everyone else was headed that way too. So we start walking up the road, my companion and I. At this point, we're just absolutely soaked. Like, I'm sure my scriptures at this point are just soaked, even though they're in like 10 bags. So we're walking up the side of the road, and it's pitch black, just pitch black. But I distinctly remember when I got out of the truck, I looked over at my companion, and he was new in the mission, so I was like training him. And I remember thinking, this kid looks like he's 30 years old, which was the most random thought, but I remember thinking his face looks so old right now. And I was like, huh, that's weird. So we keep walking up, and he'd been pretty quiet. And as we're walking, and we get like 100 yards from the turnoff to Ataco, and he goes, I'm like allergic to the cold. And I was like, what? And like in Spanish, I it didn't make sense in my head. I was like, you're allergic to cold? What does that even mean? And so he's like, we have to find shelter now, because I like get really swollen. My body swells up. And so I like looked at him and I looked at his face and I was like, oh my gosh, that's why he looks so old. And I remember all of a sudden it got super real. And I remember just thinking, this is really scary. I get goosebumps thinking about it. And I just remember praying so hard. And I remember the words of my prayer. I was like, God, I have no idea what to do, but I've been entrusted on behalf of the mission president and of this kid's parents with the safety, like in the welfare and the good training of this missionary. And I was like, help me to know what to do. Help me to help this kid. Please send someone. And I'm not kidding. I'm not a big, I'm not the kid that gets up in testimony meeting and says, I was praying and on my knees I got an answer, because that just does not happen for me. It comes later. But it was 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds later, that a truck came around the corner in the pitch black. And it was a truck that in El Salvador, they have trucks that have canopies on them and like metal cages around them, and they just transport a bunch of people. So if you don't want to go on the bus because you don't have money, which doesn't make sense because it costs like 10 cents to go on the bus, or 5 cents, or 2 cents, like it's just crazy, super cheap, you can go in one of these trucks and pay even less. This truck came by, no one in it, canopy on it, metal cage, and I remember thinking, this is straight from God. Like, God knew that I was going to be at this point because he sent that truck up 30 minutes ago, because that truck had to be coming up on the road, or he wouldn't have gotten there right as I was saying my prayer. And so that was in the moment just like a really big like faith builder. Like, God is watching out for me. Like, I know that he is. And people, you can say coincidence, you can call it whatever you want, but that was really, really big faith builder for me. So we get in the back of this truck, I help my companion, and at this point he's like struggling to move. And he gets in there and he's just silent, and he's kind of like hunched over, kind of like around his knees, and he starts shivering, and he's just like, he kind of like leans over to me, he says something, and I was like, well, maybe it's because my Spanish isn't good, I didn't understand him. But then I understand what he's saying, and he's saying, my throat is starting to close up. And I remember being so scared, and I had my arms around him, and I'm just holding him in my arms, like trying to get him warm, and I was kind of like rubbing his arms to like create friction, like just kind of rubbing his arms and his legs and like his back and stuff, just to like get some sort of friction and heat. And he goes, that it's hurting me because my skin is so sensitive, it hurts. And I had no idea what to do, so I said a prayer, and then like, I don't know if this is okay. I didn't know if it was, but at the time it was like the only thing I thought to do. And I just put my hands on his head. And right then and there in the back of the truck, I gave him a blessing, because at this point he's going, and he can't breathe. And I can hear him struggling to breathe. And he's like crying. He's super distraught. And so I put my hands on his head, and I just blessed him that his body would be able to fight this, and that he would survive. And I remember I was like, was that me or was that God? Like, was I just so scared that I said that? And it felt like, an hour. It felt like forever to get up to Apaneca when it should have only taken like 10 or 15 minutes. And there was water gushing down from the side of the mountain. This truck at one point, like the left rear wheel like swung out over the edge of like the cliffside, and it was just a terrifying experience. But we finally make it to Ataco, the turnoff, or Apaneca, and I kind of hit the truck bed, just kind of signaling, hey, this is where we get off. So he lets us off. He lets me so he stops and I get down. The funny thing about this truck was that there wasn't like glass here, it was just metal, so he couldn't see us. He was just like kind of gauging time. So I'm getting down and I'm helping my companion down. He starts to go, and my companion's still in the truck. And I remember my companion looks at me, and his backpack was like stuck. He looks at me, he looks at the truck, he looks back at me, and he just jumped. And he rolled like 4 or 5 times, and he was instantly like up on his feet. And I think there was a ton of adrenaline, but he's back on his feet. And his backpack was gone, so his camera was gone. And we'd just come from like a baptism, and he had just had a baptism like a couple days before I'd gotten there. So all his pictures were gone. But he like smashed his hand pretty good when he jumped out. And so I grab him, and I put his arm around my shoulder, and I'm just like helping him. And I had an umbrella, and he was kind of using like the umbrella as kind of like a cane. And why we didn't use the umbrella when we were walking up and like in the truck is just because they just get destroyed, and all the wind, they just get rocked. So we hadn't used it. So we're using it as a cane, and the power was out because the storm knocked the power out in Apaneca. It was out for a couple days after that. But I remember I looked at him and I was like, dude, like, why did you jump out? Like, why didn't you like try and like stop him? And he's like, I probably should have, but like I didn't want to leave you. And it was like a really surreal experience because it was so crazy and so scary, but it like made me and this kid from Colombia who was scared and he was away from home, like super tight. And it wasn't like an answer to prayers. It wasn't like we weren't friends before, but I guess we didn't have like a lot of like companionship unity. And this just like really, really brought us close together, but at the same time, like really showed us how much God's hand was in our life. So I know that was a story about the weather, but it was just like a really spiritual experience that I had with a storm. Super scary. It was terrifying. I thought my companion was going to die, but like it was cool.